Hello, everyone. Welcome. Welcome again to the FMB webinar. We're going to be talking about changes to test prep and college admissions. In these extraordinary times, need to do a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. Number one, like most Zoom calls these days, this one is being recorded, so just so you know. Also, we're using the Q&A feature, so we've got that enabled. You should be able to ask questions via the Q&A option, and we'll be sifting through questions at the end, and we'll do the Q&A portion at the end. Want to introduce the panelists with me who are also presenting. I've got Hannah Vanderloop here, who is our Director of Test Prep at FNB. She comes to us originally from the great state of Wisconsin, but was most recently in New York City as the Director of Test Prep for a boutique test prep firm, larger than FNB. So we're really glad that she is with us tonight. We also have Alex Wellman, who's our Assistant Director of College Advising. He was a two-sport athlete at Middlebury and was the Director of College Advising at GFA, Queens Farms Academy in Westport. And he's now working very closely with Kim on the college advising process with our students. He's a member of IECA and NACAC, and we're glad to have him on board as well. So I will say that this is a little unnatural as it goes for FNB, because we're really a face-to-face organization, and it is weird to be doing a webinar. I'm used to seeing faces go past my door in the office and meeting people in person. So this is a little bit strange, but I think it's a sign of the extraordinary times that we're in right now, that this is what we're doing. So thank you again for joining us. So my wife has been marking off the days on the calendar on our fridge since the quarantine started on March 13th, Friday the 13th, unfortunately. And she let me know today that this is the 40th day, actually, of our social distancing. And it struck me that it's a little bit like Noah's Ark, in that we're all in really tight quarters with family members and pets, animals in with us. And we are kind of facing a deluge, a lot of sea of uncertainty around us. And you probably noticed the torrential rains today, so it did seems fitting. I recognize that there are more important things going on in the world right now. Some of our clients are physicians. There's one family where one of the parents is on the front lines in the ER at a local hospital, and is literally living in the basement right now to stay safe, keep his family safe from anything he might be exposed to. And it's just, it's kind of incredible. iPad at the dinner table, so we can virtually join his family for dinner. This really is incredible. And so I know there's a lot of things upside down, and test prep and college are certainly not the most important things that we're dealing with. But I also think, we do have questions, and our kids have to sort of move forward, and we have to figure out a way forward in this process. So I know at some point the floodwaters will recede, and we're going to be back on dry land, and we need to be able to hit the ground running when that happens. So I do want to talk, I want to give you a sense of what we're going to touch base on tonight, what we're talking about. So there is quite a changing landscape, right? We have test cancellations, which has been disheartening for a lot of kids. It's been stressful for all of us. And the question is, when will kids be able to take their tests, right? And then we've seen announcements from a lot of schools that they're going test optional. And so what does that mean for college admissions? Do kids even need to take these standardized tests? And then the timelines, if they do take the tests, when should they take them? How do they take them? How do they get prepared to take them? So first, what we do know, and this is the bad news, March SAT canceled, April ACT canceled, May SAT canceled, The AP exams are still on, but they're at home. 45 minutes, open note, open book. It's going to be a different experience. College Board is adapting, and we'll see how it goes, but they're still happening. The June 6th SAT and the subject tests are canceled. The ACT, however, is taking a different direction. They have not yet canceled the June 13th test date. In fact, it's still on. The July 18th is still scheduled. And in fact, they've added makeup dates. And this is perhaps optimistic thinking, but under the possibility that maybe 1 week would make a difference, right? It might be the case that June 13th is not an option, but they want to be ready if June 20th makes a difference. They've got a makeup date ready to go. Same thing with April, with July. There's another makeup date as well. So it could be optimistic, but ACT is staying the course. And so those test dates as of now are still on. And in fact, they've actually added locations. Historically, the ACT is not available in New York State in July for sort of strange legal reasons that I don't fully understand, but has been prohibited from offering the ACT in July. They waived that this year. And so there are New York State test dates now for the July ACT. There are new spots open in Connecticut. They've added capacity. So the ACT seems to think that it's a possibility and they're going to stay open. So those are the cancellations, the things that are open. We'll talk later about the dates in the fall and the rest of the summer and what the timeline looks like for that. But let's talk about test optional first, because if students could go test optional, maybe the tests don't matter, right? If that's the case, we don't need to worry about what happens in the fall. So first of all, test optional is not a new concept, right? It's been around for a while. There are a number of schools that have decided that they want to reduce barriers for disadvantaged applicants. So typically, these are smaller liberal arts colleges that have wanted to increase diversity on campus, want to reduce barriers to entrance, want to increase access to colleges. And standardized test scores can be one of those obstacles if students know that typically scores are here for a college and the students know they only have these kinds of scores, they might self-select and not apply. And so it's been a way to try and do something do something noble, right, which is to increase access. There is also a slightly more self-serving motive with test optional, and that is that when schools have gone test optional, they've seen significant increases in their applicant pool. And so there's a cycle where you have more applicants, you end up accepting about the same amount you would always accept, which means the fraction is smaller and they are more selective and increase the rankings. So there's both a noble reason for test optional and a bit of a strategic or marketing reason for the colleges who've done that historically. And again, it's typically benefited two populations, the first generation applicants, underrepresented minority groups, as well as students with really significant discrepancies between their academic profile and their performance on standardized tests. But again, emphasis on significant discrepancies. So Alex Wellman, as I mentioned, our Assistant Director of College Advising, has been following these trends very closely, talking to reps, talking to Kim, and so I want to turn it over to him to talk about more about test optional now and what that means.
Great, thanks, Trey. And thanks everyone for being here this evening. We really appreciate you making the time. So, the question is, what does test optional mean now? And, will all colleges be test optional this coming year? No, they will not. And then another question, if a college is test optional, you are not required to submit test scores. That's true. Test optional colleges do not require you to submit test scores to complete an application, but that's where I'd want to draw the distinction between what constitutes a complete application and what constitutes a complete and competitive application. Over the course of the last couple of weeks, I've been canvassing admissions directors and deans at a range of schools, some with established test optional programs, and then also some that just announced that they would go test optional for this coming cycle, so for whom it's a brand new thing. The general outcomes of these conversations underscore a lot of what Trey said. And specifically that for the demographic here in Fairfield County, standardized testing is a really useful tool that benefits the applicant. One admissions director that I spoke with at a very highly selective institution that's historically had admissions rates below 15%, which just made the decision to go test optional, his exact quote to me was, "It's test optional, not test free." Folded into that is the idea that standardized testing is a helpful metric, both to colleges that have historically relied upon it, and also to students who are applying to those colleges from this demographic, from this applicant pool. He basically said, and I brought up a conversation that I had with another admissions dean in which she quoted and said, if you're going to apply to us test optional, your transcript had better make us think that you would have done exceptionally well on the test. And he echoed that sentiment 100%. I also spoke with an admissions director at a moderately selective institution with a very established test optional program who echoed this point. She said, not including testing means that greater scrutiny gets placed on other elements of the application, namely the transcript, and also letters of recommendation. This admission reps college actually does interviews in lieu of accepting standardized tests if applicants choose to go test optional. I asked her the question, I said, well, the UCs are, a huge state system, which have just recently decided that they are going to go test optional for the upcoming cycle. What's that going to look like? And, one of the questions that she raised was how larger institutions like the UC system, UC Berkeley gets close to 90,000 applications per year, for example, how they're going to be able to successfully scale to a test optional model in a way that honors the integrity of the process and that also serves the applicant and gives the applicant, a fair shake in that pool. More broadly, especially at larger state schools, but certainly as we'll discuss at smaller private schools as well, standardized testing is a really, really important metric when you're getting that many tens of thousands of applications. I spoke also with an admissions dean at Providence who said that he anticipated that the removal of standardized testing would lead to the competition for greater competition among highly qualified diverse applicants. He saw that number was going to increase. And he said that they saw that at his school when they made that move. But if you also look at trends and what history has taught us about the shift to test optional, it is that it does drive up the number of applications and conversely drives down the acceptance rate. Colby College is a perfect example of this. In 2014, they had an overall acceptance rate of close to 30%. They just published less than a month ago their numbers for the class of 2024. And the overall admit rate at Colby is now 9%, approximately 1,300 acceptances for, just under or just over 13,500 applications. What happened there? A couple of things. Along the way, they made the decision to remove the supplemental essay on their application. That's the removal of a barrier that made the application easier to complete. And then in the fall of 2018, they announced that for the 2018-2019 application cycle, they were going to go test optional. And the numbers, which had been steadily decreasing at that point, actually fell off even more sharply. And so, as Trey said, we are sort of sitting in a sea of uncertainty right now. It's not entirely clear what's ahead of us, but we look to history to educate us and to help us make predictions about what will come. And test optional, to Trey's point, does generally mean more competitive, and it does generally mean greater access, which just means more applicants will be applying. So I'm more than happy at the end of this to take questions specifically on test optional, specifically on what that means for the landscape, but want to turn it back over to Trey now.
Great, thanks, Alex. Appreciate that. So there have been a lot of announcements. It seems like every day there's a new headline out there talking about a number of schools going test optional, and I would just like to interpret that a little bit. And try to put it in some context. So first of all, 50 schools is a relatively small number in the scheme of things, right? Because 3,000 colleges across the country, it's still a very small fraction that have changed their policies temporarily. Many of the schools that we've seen have actually had already been piloting or considering piloting these programs, and they simply accelerated them 1 year. So Tufts, for instance, was looking to pilot a test optional program. They accelerated that by 1 year. So these are not unplanned. The admissions offices had those things in the works. But it's also interesting to look at some of the trends in the schools that have made these changes. So one option is one factor seems to be geography, right? So some of the first schools to announce were in hotspots of the COVID-19 outbreak. So coastal schools, California, Oregon State, and University of Oregon. We've also seen Boston, which was a very early hotspot. So BU, Northeastern, Tufts, New Orleans was a hotspot, and Tulane announced it was test optional, right? And so that sort of tells me again that these are schools that are looking not to make some broad statement about their applicant pool in general, but in response to the ongoing situation on the ground in those various locales, right? And trying to be responsive to the needs of the communities locally. We also saw small liberal arts colleges, Williams, Middlebury, Amherst, schools that are part of that NESCAC group that have moved test optional this year. And that, again, seems to be consistent with a peer group, other institutions in that small liberal arts college pool that have at times had success with the test optional model. So we're seeing that. It's not a radical departure from the norm. And then I would also say that some of the schools like BU and Tufts might also be looking at that strategic advantage to get more students in, drive the admit rates down, right? And therefore increase their potential in the rankings. So those are some of the ways I've been thinking about the schools that have announced. What's also interesting is the schools that haven't announced a test optional policy for this fall. So we haven't seen state schools shifting in mass. We haven't seen Wisconsin, we haven't seen Michigan, Indiana, Penn State, Arizona, these sort of large state institutions. They have not yet indicated, things could change, but as of now, they have not changed their policies. Large private schools that have a large volume of applicants, the Syracuses of the world, Miami, USC, Northwestern, WashU, these are schools that are holding the course and have not shifted their policies. So, and even a note about California system, it really is situational. There's actually a lawsuit right now that has been levied against California, where some people have said that the standardized tests are discriminatory and should not be permitted to be used as admissions criteria. UC is obviously fighting that in court. They're fighting for the right to still use test scores on an ongoing basis. They're just making an exception in this year. So really just wanted to reiterate that we do think that this is mostly a response to considerations for geographical concerns to the outbreak and its impact on individuals, rather than a sea change, as some of the news media has indicated. Obviously, things are evolving, and we'll keep everyone posted if we do see something significant in the future. But it looks to us like students are going to need test scores, and either because it's just going to be expected, right, of students in this demographic, right, from elite private schools, from affluent districts, right? They understand, as Alex said, that these students have typically had access to testing throughout junior year. There are going to be a number of tests in the fall, and so there will be opportunity for testing, and it will still look odd if those students do not submit scores. And if you wanted to navigate a list of schools that was only test optional, that would be really tricky, because again, it's still kind of a patchwork. It's not something more across the board. So if they really do need test scores, and here we are with tests that have been canceled from March through now, how are we going to make that happen? What's next? So I want to talk about fall test dates and what's happening with fall tests, because a lot is changing actually here. So first of all, the SAT has an August test date, August 29th. That is the next available chance to take the SAT. You could take subject tests, you could take the regular SAT. College Board has also announced that they're adding a September test, which they do not typically offer. And then they've historically had October, November, and December. So what you see is one test per month from August through December for the SAT. You can't register yet, but that will come online in mid-May. And if you registered for the webinar, we will share that information with you when we get that notification. We'll send out an email blast that says registration's open. If you want to register, go ahead, here's your chance. One thing to note, they are giving priority registration for students who are going to be seniors, class of 2021, who have not yet taken the SAT. There's some concern about how accessible this will be, how much volume these test centers can handle in the fall. And so priority will be given to seniors who do not yet have test scores. So if you're in the class of 2022, don't think about trying to take an SAT in that August or probably even the September window. And there are other reasons why we don't recommend the SAT for juniors in the fall anyway, which we can talk about later. But it's really going to be senior focused for these fall test dates at first. The ACT has taken a different approach than College Board. It's sort of interesting to see. I think some of it comes from the fact that it's in Iowa, it's in the Midwest, and College Board based in New York City and the East Coast, right? So we have sort of really different geographic locations for these organizations. Also, College Board is a much larger organization and has a lot of state contracts that they're looking to reschedule for the fall. The ones like Connecticut had a March SAT that was supposed to be administered, got canceled. College Board will probably recoup some of that revenue in the fall with other test dates at the state level. ACT is not as large an organization, and their livelihood is a little bit more in jeopardy with these cancellations of tests. So they have a little bit more financial incentive to keep the test going. And again, I also think there's a philosophical difference in these test organizations where the ACT is taking a page from the playbook of some other people in this country to say, let's let the states decide, let's let the local organizations decide. And so the local institutions, schools that are hosting are actually going to make decisions about whether to open up or not for the June and July test dates. I think if the ACT was going to make a national announcement and cancel all of them, they had the window of opportunity when the SAT canceled, and instead they doubled down by adding backup dates and expanding test sites for July. So really seems like they're taking a different approach. There will also be a September, October, and December ACT, as there always are for the ACT. However, there might even be more. The ACT registration for the fall is not available yet. Again, hang in there. They were somewhat vague about midsummer dates. We will send an email out to everyone when the ACT does open up new registration dates. The ACT has also been experimenting with a lot of new options for how to take the test and the format of it. And this is worth discussing in depth here. So you may have heard of this, but if not, this is really big news. Historically, when you take the SAT or the ACT, you have to take the whole test, right? The entire 4 sections, plus or minus the essay, that's just how it goes. But the ACT has decided to decouple the individual sections from the rest of the test. And so as of this fall, it will be possible for students who have already taken an ACT, taken one ACT already, to then retest in a single section or up to 3 individual sections on a separate test date. So this really opens up an interesting possibility where a student could take the test in its entirety, get certain scores. Let's say that they're in pre-calc as a junior and they haven't had all of the material yet. So trigonometry is typically covered in the second half of the year, typically in April and May. Students are studying that right now in pre-calc classes. And there's a fair bit of pre-calc on the, and specifically trigonometry on the ACT math section. So a student who is in pre-calc would have a hard time getting the best score possible in the fall of their junior year. But they might take the test, do well on 3 of the 4 sections, and consider retesting just the math section in the spring in an April test or a June test when they've had that pre-calc content, we've had the trigonometry at the end of junior year. So that really opens up some options that have not existed before. A couple things to note about this. I do not think that this will be applicable for people in the class of 2021. Okay, so I do not think that seniors this fall will be able to take advantage of the single section retests, because typically colleges like to roll out policies for an entire cohort at the same time. And it would be strange for a bunch of students to have taken the test under one set of rules and then to change the rules only a few months before the admission deadlines. So I don't suspect that seniors will be able to take advantage, but we'll see. It really depends on the colleges and how they respond to this information. We have yet to see colleges actually come out with their own statements about how they're going to respond to this. But I do suspect that students who are class of 2022 and younger will have this as an option, and it could be a very strategic option in the testing landscape. Also, there is an option now. The ACT is offering campus-based testing, which is a new format. So students who are applying to a particular university can take the test at that university. What's odd about this is that those scores will only count for applicants for that university. So this is really a move by state schools, typically local schools, to attract applicants from within their geographic region, right? Potentially also NCAA recruits and athletes, but it's not likely to be a big option for most students nationwide. The other thing that is worth mentioning, and this could be a really big game changer, is that the ACT has been experimenting with a computerized format for 4 years now. Since 2016, there's been a version of the ACT that's administered on a computer in small numbers of students in the US, but it's been the only way the ACT has been administered internationally since 2018. There are concerns about test security internationally. We've heard issues in Asia in particular of students gaining access to the answer keys or the test booklet somehow before the physical copies were released. And one way to increase test security has been to computerize the test and make sure that people are in a computer testing center taking the test on a computer format. There are no booklets to leak in advance. So that precedent exists. The ACT has a computerized format, and it's actually possible that these single section retests will be done on computer. They haven't said that definitively, but I suspect that when you're retesting for math or reading only, it might be on the computer. But what this also opens up a possibility for is at-home testing, right? College Board led the way this spring. We've got the AP exams proctored with a lockdown browser with a lot of security protocols, different format to accommodate that. But the APs at home in May. We also have GRE and GMAT, the tests for grad school and business school, which are currently being administered computerized at home with virtual proctors. So there's a precedent for this, and we are going to see it this fall. The College Board has also said that the SAT will be able to do at-home testing this fall if necessary. So while we have some uncertainty about the SAT, certainly it's not happening this spring, it's not happening in June. There's some uncertainty about the ACT. Will it actually happen in June and July? But I can say that I'm pretty confident that the fall test dates will happen in one form or another. At home, online, in testing centers, they're moving forward with options. They can't afford to be sidelined and to lose all this revenue. The colleges also clearly want this information. So it's moving forward one way or another for the fall. So I want to talk a little bit about preparing then for the SAT and the timelines and strategies for that. So one of the things that We like to do it at F&B. We kind of geek out about this stuff. This is definitely our bread and butter. So I was a psychology major at Cornell. My first job out of college was working in a psychology lab at Yale, working in cognition and development. My business partner, Kim, has a PhD in developmental psychology and neuropsych, has a lot of history with large-scale assessments in the public school settings that used IQ metrics and other sort of academic indicators. So it's really interesting to see where these tests came from, how they're constructed, and how that informs how we can help kids succeed on them. So a little history of the ACT and SAT. First of all, the SAT was historically derived from IQ testing, basically. There were tests that were used by the US Army originally to try and figure out how to handle the volume of people they were getting in the draft in World War I, how to sort who had what skill set. And so there were tests to try and figure out who had visual puzzles, visual skill sets, who had auditory skill sets, who were able to follow instructions, sequential thinking, strategic thinking. They were really looking to figure out who can fix tanks, who can fix things, who can follow orders, and how to sort people. And the IQ test was the tool that they used. Ultimately, it was adapted for use in the Ivy Leagues as an admissions test. Ironically, it was intended to increase access originally, right? The intent was to find talented students who had aptitude, who were not coming from the traditional private school pipelines. And historically, admissions tests for Harvard, Yale involved translating Greek and Latin, right? These were not things you were getting access to in a public school in Missouri, right? These were things that only the elite in these East Coast private schools were able to even succeed at. But there was a movement to make the Ivies more accessible. And so the SAT was in fact intended to capture talented youth who had otherwise been overlooked. A little bit ironic given the way things are now, but that's the history of it. Reason that's useful information is that the SAT is still, even through all of its revisions, it's still a norm reference test. That is, it is forced into a normal curve, right? It's graded on a curve, and it still has these elements of IQ testing where it captures working memory, it captures visual and verbal problem solving, and students' ability to follow multi-step directions, things like that. So that informs both how we prep for that test and when we take it, okay? Because the SAT is norm reference, we discourage juniors from taking the SAT in the fall. And the reasoning is fairly simple. There are still seniors taking the SAT in the fall, right? Seniors who've had a year more prep, who've had a year more math, and it doesn't make a lot of sense for juniors to go head to head in a test that's graded on a curve, right? So generally the advice, and this is not just us, but this is Hopkins College Counseling, GFA College Counseling, Staples, etc. Generally the advice is save the SAT for the spring when the seniors are out of the pool and the juniors are only competing against themselves, right? The ACT, however, is a different model. Like I said, it comes from Iowa, and it has roots in just a different philosophy of how to test. It's based on achievement testing. And the simple premise is that if you measure up to a certain level of achievement or certain performance, you'll get a certain score. It's not graded on a curve. They're not forcing it to a normal distribution every time. Basically, they're looking at benchmarks of achievement or performance, and that's how the scores are determined. So if students are at a certain level, they'll get a certain score. And so it makes sense to have juniors take the test when they're ready in the fall, or even just to start practicing in the fall to get more exposure to it and get better at it, right? We don't have to save it for the spring like we do with the SAT. When I took the SAT in high school, I didn't even know there was an ACT. There's some biases, right? Historically, where the Midwest was the ACT, from Hannah's home state of Wisconsin, Ohio, Illinois, Missouri, states like that, right? Colorado, historically ACT states. However, when the SAT changed in 2005, that was a really significant revision, and it created a lot of uncertainty, both for students and for colleges, about how does this new test work? Is it equivalent to the old test? And so we saw at F&B a number of students take the ACT in Connecticut for the first time in 2005. And the percentages have only grown since then, so where it's now 50-50. All colleges that accept test scores, and again, that's all colleges in the country except one. There's only one school in the country that does not accept your test scores, Hampshire College, right? They're the only test blind college. But so if a school accepts test scores, and they all do except one, right? They'll take either the ACT or the SAT, and they do not have a preference. There is no preference between ACT or SAT. There's simply a chart that has been compiled between College Board and ACT of how to equate an ACT score to an SAT score. Basically, they looked at a lot of students who've taken the tests over the years and they correlated them to where we have a crosswalk. And so the colleges, honestly, they don't care, they just convert and work off of that. So really the benefit is who's a better fit, right? So let's talk just quickly about the timeline to give you a sense of how typically students are moving through this process. So in 10th grade, we might do a planning meeting in the fall of 10th grade to think about how the student is setting up their courses, what the extracurriculars are looking like, how to help families and students think about profiles, right? Typically, we're having students take the ACT practice test at our office, or these days with a virtual proctor at home, but typically an ACT practice test in the spring of 10th grade. And we compare that to the PSAT 10 that a lot of students will have in the spring at their own high school. Plan for the summer, what kind of extracurriculars should they be investigating? How do they build their profile? The summer before 11th grade is also a great time to start with test prep. We do intensive test prep weeks or weekly across the summer, depends on what's best for the student and the schedule. Moving into the fall, typically most students are prepping throughout junior year. Again, we're looking at a fall test date in the ACT, whereas we're thinking about the spring, saving the SAT for the spring. Fall of 11th grade also has the PSAT. Moving into the spring, students are often still prepping, again, especially if they're in pre-calc. They're getting some of that trigonometry only in April, May, and so there's a lot of pre-calc content that they're benefiting from during junior year. So retaking the SAT, or excuse me, retaking the ACT, maybe only single sections, potentially depending on the policies. And then potentially SAT subject tests, although to be honest, those are diminishing. In the summer, ideally at this point, students are wrapping up and have gotten their scores in one of the spring tests, right? But some students might still need to retake if they got a late start or they really have a high ceiling. They may need to take the tests again over the summer and the fall. But ideally, the summer is a good time for writing college essays and preparing for the start of senior year. 12th grade, again, some seniors will be retesting. This year, we'll have a lot of seniors who are retesting because of the cancellation. So that's going to be unusual this year. Most students would be finished by then, but if needed. Okay. So then getting to the question of ACT or SAT, how would you decide which test to take? Well, at one level, fairly simple, is compare the practice test of the ACT to a PSAT or an SAT practice test, right? It's a data-driven decision that we can make and see where the student's starting off better. There's another component to look at, and that's simply the math level. So as I mentioned, ACT has pre-calc content on it, trigonometry. If a student is taking Algebra 2 in junior year, there's a lot of material they're not going to get to until senior year that's on the ACT math section, and that can put them at a disadvantage. The SAT doubles down on Algebra 1 and Algebra 2 content and has a lot less of the pre-calc. And so sometimes the math level can be a constraint for students and might cause us to shift SAT if the students are taking Algebra 2 in junior year. Another big one is timing. And this is really significant because there's a very big difference in how students experience the two tests. The ACT, especially on the reading and science sections, require that students hustle. It's fairly tight and the students are moving quickly in order to finish. And often on their first practice test, in fact, they don't finish. They end up guessing on some portion of the last passage on reading, the last passage, or the whole last passage on science. That's pretty typical. The SAT, on the other hand, has timing that is more forgiving, but there has to be a trade-off, and that is that the content is more difficult. So basically the SAT has more sophisticated reading content. The narrative is often something from the early 1900s, sort of a novel, even the 1800s, a Jane Austen piece, or something that's more sophisticated. There are primary source materials on the SAT. There are founding documents from our country, like the Federalist Papers, or something like the Lincoln-Douglas debates. There are issues around civil rights and women's rights. So you might see Mary Wollstonecraft and an essay from the 1790s, right, discussing women's rights, things that are, again, historic pieces. And that can create some challenge for students. Again, not all the pieces are that way, but up to 2 of the 5 passages on the SAT are more sophisticated like that. And so some students, even with the extra time on the SAT, still find that that's a struggle. The ACT reading is much more straightforward, much more likely to be from recent documents and more accessible. So that can be a trade-off. And of course, students have some input in this process. Sometimes they have very strong opinions, and unless they're really mistaken, we do want their input in this process. This is a good way to kind of think about the overlap, because there is actually a lot of overlap between the 2 tests. Grammar is an essential element of both the ACT and the SAT. It's something that isn't taught a lot these days in public schools. Some of the private schools do a better job with this, especially if they're teaching Latin in the middle schools or things like that. But these days, a lot of the public schools are doing writing in a much more organic fashion. And so you don't see a lot of direct grammar instruction. And that's a struggle for students. It's also an area where we see a lot of improvement. Because students haven't learned it, we can teach it to them. It's a very coachable section. And there's a lot of overlap in the format. Algebra, geometry, content, reading comprehension. The first passage on the SAT is a narrative. The first passage on the ACT is a narrative. There's a natural science passage on both. There's social science passages on both the SAT and ACT reading. Problem solving strategies, visual literacy, information literacy, these are all areas of overlap. Even the science section, which of course is a dedicated science section on the ACT, but not on the SAT. Even the science section has an analog on the SAT, because there are now charts and graphs embedded in the grammar, reading, and math sections of the SAT. So students will do a grammar passage, but then have to answer questions that say, which of these sentences is most consistent with the information that was presented here, and is consistent with the point of the passage. So it's the intersection of information and text, information literacy. So this is something that the tests share in common. There is a no calculator section on the SAT, so some mental math is required, whereas you can use a calculator on the entire math section of the ACT. Again, time pressure, ACT, less time pressure, SAT. But again, the take home is a lot of things overlap. And I do want to mention that beyond the test prep itself, the strategies for reading and science sections and math sections, a lot of the students' success or difficulties come from their own individual differences. And again, this is something that is really baked into how we think about testing at F&B. Helps that we have the psychology background that we do, the cognition development work that we've done. But basically, if a student is impulsive, right, if they tend to misread details in the question, if they tend to pick an answer before they finish reading the answer choices, well, that's going to be a problem on either test, right? That's a habit we're going to have to work with them to break. If students are deliberative and they tend to second guess themselves, right, they're going to be struggling with that on either the SAT or the ACT, right? So these are the kinds of behavioral adjustments that we want to coach students through. And those often explain a lot of both the struggles that students have on the test, and they also explain the gains that students have that they can make on these tests when they are able to kind of recognize and have that metacognitive awareness that, wait, I was being impulsive, I need to rein it in, and actually finish reading the whole question, right? Finish reading the answer choices like that. Those skills are actually hard because the kids have had these habits for their whole lifetime, but they are coachable, and we want to work on that. So I know we have a lot of seniors, or parents of seniors in the population, so I want to make sure we have time for questions about that. Basically, one of our closing thoughts is from Kim. She's not here, but she passed on a little bit to me, and basically her take is that where we take the tests and maybe when we take the tests is changing, but we really still have to take the tests. She said, this idea that somehow this year we're going to have a free pass and get out of this, that the rules are really going to change dramatically. She said that's just magical thinking, right? There are going to be schools with test optional, right? And probably the list is going to grow. But there are very likely still going to be some schools on your list, or your child's list, that are not test optional. And again, because of the demographic for most of the people, I know all of you, mostly coming from Fairfield County, private schools like Choate, Hopkins, GFA, et cetera. Those are not places that the test optional is going to be an easy sell for, right? The admissions officers review based on regions, based on very specific areas. They know Connecticut, they know the Connecticut schools, they know what's typical, and it's not typical for students not to have taken tests yet. It's not typical for them not to submit tests, and so it will stand out, it will look odd. So I really think we have to try and keep moving forward and give, part of this is about giving kids a sense of normalcy, that everything is changing and there's a lot that's different, right? We're doing school in different ways, how we do school, where we do school, but we're still doing school and we still have to find ways to move forward. Great, so I would like to take some of the questions so we can respond to that. Hannah has been monitoring our questions. Do you want to work through some of those, Hannah?
Sure. So the first question that was asked, and we kind of already hinted to it, but the question was, what do you think of the importance of the SAT subject tests are now? Unfortunately for me, I absolutely love the SAT subject tests, but I'm in the far minority who actually loves them. In New York City, every student was taking SAT subject tests to get that competitive edge. But really in the past 2 years or so, the importance and the emphasis on them has really declined. So even before COVID, there was already a decreased emphasis on SAT subject tests. For our class of 2021, for our rising seniors and who are applying, some schools have waived the SAT subject test requirements. June was, the huge test date for SAT subject tests. It was a great time for students to take the SAT subject tests that were most directly tied to their school curriculum. So the physics, the chemistry, the bio, the math level 2. They recognized that by canceling that test date, students would have to put it off to after summer of having off, which is hard. So it's still going to be a school by school basis, but definitely what's more important is strong performance in the upper level courses and a strong ACT or SAT score, which was always the most important standardized test score that could be submitted. And another question was giving us a scenario of 3 students apply to a highly competitive test optional school, all have a similar background. This question is obviously difficult to answer, but assuming they're all identical and the only thing that's different is that one doesn't submit a score, one submits a 35 on the ACT and one submits a 31 who gets in. It's obviously going to be the kid, all factors even, who submits that 35 on the ACT. That's the top 1% of test takers. It's the top score.
And if I can elaborate on that a little bit. So most of these schools have rating systems. So like, there's a very highly selective liberal arts college up in Vermont that has a rating system of 1 through 7. And, if you have a student who is, let's say you got 3 students who are, all A- level kids, And maybe they're A- level kids for different reasons. One had a slower start to high school and really, really caught fire in 10th or 11th grade and has brought those grades up. Or you've got another kid who was just consistently earning those A- across the board. Or you've got, certainly the inverse of the first scenario. You've got a kid who started off really strong, but who tapered a little bit. At the end of the day, if you've got 3 kids who, for whatever reason, have very, very similar metrics, and one goes with a 35, that kid's going to be getting read at probably a 5 or a 6 on that scale of 1 to 7. If you've got a kid who goes with a 31, they're probably looking at like a 4. And if you've got a kid who goes test optional, they're probably a 3 on that scale of 1 to 7. So just to add a little bit of context and a little bit of color to what Hannah said there, and just to sort of elaborate a little bit and to extrapolate a little bit from kind of the strands of that question.
Cool, thank you, Alex. Our next question was another, just a question about the single section retest for the ACT. Is it allowed for the class of 2021? It's definitely allowed. Students will be allowed to take a single section or retake a single section as long as they've already taken an ACT. But it is doubtful that colleges will actually use the new ACT policy in this admission cycle. So it would still be a school by school basis. It would be a college that accepts super scoring on the ACT, so taking the top score from each section in addition to this new policy. And because the September ACT will be the first time that students are allowed to retake a single section, it's doubtful that admissions will accept this widespread for our class of 2021. In the future, we'll see. It's definitely something that we're excited about, especially with the math leveling. If a student's currently in pre-calc, but they're rock stars at all other 3 sections, it's definitely nicer and easier to prepare for 1 section at a time than all 4, and nailing the 3.5 hour, 5 hour test if you have extra time. There are a couple other questions rolling in that I haven't yet sorted through yet, so give this a minute. Feel free to pop them up.
One quick correction. I mentioned Indiana. Indiana recently announced test optional. Thank you for that correction, Alex.
So there's a question being asked, if many colleges go virtual in fall of 2020, do you think they will allow students to defer their matriculation to fall 2021, thereby taking seats from 2021 grads? A lot of speculation that's happening right now because this situation is evolving day by day. But if we look at what we do know, looking at 2008, 2009, there was a huge economic downturn that happened then. And if you look at historical admit data for colleges during that time, they actually became less selective, depended on the initial selectivity of the school, but they became less selective in their early decision rounds. So all of that to say, the current junior class, class of 2021, is going to be heading into an admission cycle where seats are going to likely be a little bit less competitive as far as early decision is concerned. Colleges know that, and every college is going to handle this a little bit differently. So what I said there is sort of like precursor to this. Every college is going to handle situations a little bit differently in terms of deferring or taking gap years. Gap years for them do mean lost revenue. They mean that they are going to be struggling to make ends meet. There are going to be budgetary concerns. So we don't know what's going to happen in terms of what's going to happen with colleges permitting gap years, the extent to which they're going to permit gap years. It's going to be driven largely by individual colleges' priorities, and also by what happens really over the course of the next 6 to 7 weeks. That's probably when we're going to start to get a little bit more information about what colleges are thinking for the fall.
I have a couple thoughts I'll add to that as well. So a number of schools have January term admit programs where they offer students spots in January. And it's possible that a school could decide to turn down students who want to take a full gap year, right? That's a really difficult situation for a college to, as Alex said, to lose someone for the entire year. It means pulling kids off the wait list who may not have been as competitive. There's a number of reasons why they would maybe not want to do that. But there is a precedent among schools for admitting students for the spring term. And it's possible that we could see colleges kind of cap the number of gap years they permit. So they could offer admission and say, yes, you got in, and it's conditioned upon you starting in the fall, and for others, it might be conditioned upon them starting in the January term, and then limiting the number of people who would take a gap year. Obviously, many students may want to do that, but colleges may not want them to. And so we may see that there's some of the offers actually condition them on the student being willing to accept on a given start time. It's possible with the January start and a summer semester at some point that cycle, that class that is starting this fall could get back on cycle and finish up, right, and graduate on time. So it wouldn't be crazy for that to happen. The other thing that could happen on this front, I think it's very unlikely that we're going to see the numbers of international applicants this fall that we've historically seen, right? There were already some concerns with international applicants applying. Our country's immigration policy has not necessarily been the most welcoming. And so we've seen some concerns from international applicants over the years. But even more so now, I think, given the health concerns, we expect that there will be fewer international applicants for the spots this fall.
And then I think one other thing that's sort of parallel to what Trey has said is I also think there's a good chance that next fall, depending on what's happening with the state of schools and depending on what's happening with really families' relative comfort levels, just sort of on the national level, we may see more and more kids looking to go to school more locally for them and feeling less inclined to leave their own home state to go to college. So that could also be a factor that plays in there. So that there are a lot of factors, some of which compete with one another, some of which complement one another, and some of which balance one another, that will clarify themselves as this process unfolds and as more information comes in.
Great. I just saw another question come through. The question was, with remote learning, currently, are students in the class of 2021 at a disadvantage because they're not learning new material at the same rate as if they were in the classroom, particularly math? So I don't think this is limited to the class of 2021. We have concerns about this for all of our students, to be honest. It was really hard for schools to pivot quickly to online learning, to go to distance learning. And so at first we saw schools close to kind of regroup. Then we saw schools offer busy work that was under the guise of keeping students busy, but not actually delivering new material, not teaching new content, right? And then at some point, schools realized, wait, this is actually the new normal, and we're gonna have to figure this out. And they really had to start finding ways to teach new content, deliver instruction to students virtually, and keep them moving forward. And so we clearly lost several weeks in that process as schools were figuring out how to do this. And we've seen that it's just not the same pace of instruction. It's not the same volume of time that teachers are in front of students. And so I do worry, particularly for subjects that are cumulative. So math, the languages, right? Something at Hopkins like AC1, AC2, where there's supposed to be some curriculum transition from the first year to the next year. I'm concerned about those classes not having the continuity and the content that they typically do. So we've encouraged students to try to go above and beyond and to do some extra work to really stick with it and learn the material. It's not like they're not going to need math when they get to calculus, right? If you miss some stuff at the end of pre-calc, like, you're going to need that for calculus, right? If you miss things at the end of algebra 2, you're going to need that for pre-calc. That's the way math works. Or college, if you're going to take economics classes or business classes, you're going to need those math skills. You're going to need those reading skills, literature skills. So I do worry about this to some degree. I will say that I think students are, by and large, pretty resilient, and we've seen a lot of responsibility on the parts of students to sort out what they've got, what's due, stay on top of things. There are obviously individual variations, degrees of executive functioning and degrees of motivation. So I qualify that statement, but for the most part, students have been working pretty hard. If anything, though, we've seen that they haven't had nearly as much work as they typically would. And so that presents a challenge then, because they have time on their hands, nowhere to go. And so it is a good opportunity to take advantage. If you're a senior, if you're class of 2021, right? If you're going to be a senior next year, this is a great time to start working on essays, right? It's not too early. There might even be a supplement next year of how has COVID-19 affected me? Probably not the best topic for a main essay, but not a bad draft to work on as a supplement, right? So this is a great chance to work on essays, to take virtual tours, right? And also, if you're a junior, it's a great time to finish up the year strong. A lot of students are seeing their grades come up at the end of the year because of the online learning. The volume's a little bit down, and so your grades could go up, and that's a great opportunity to do that. We have some other questions. I've seen some questions about accommodations that have been coming through as well. So I think if I understand the question, accommodations process for test prep for SAT and ACT. It's very similar, in fact, because both SAT and ACT have largely outsourced the decision of whether students should qualify for accommodations to the high schools that students attend. It used to be the case that students could make an application directly to the College Board or directly to ACT, and they had to submit all of this documentation to demonstrate some kind of disability, right, some kind of need for accommodations to the test companies themselves, to ACT, to SAT, and then those organizations would make those decisions on their own. But now, College Board and the ACT largely match the accommodations that are present in the high school. So if you have a student who has some diagnosed learning issue, learning difference, and is receiving accommodations for that in their high school, there's a very good chance that they should qualify for the same set of accommodations on the SAT or the ACT. Now, there are some caveats. Every situation is different, but really the first step is to make sure that the student's IEP or 504 that's in place at the high school specifies the accommodations that that student needs in the test prep, in the test taking environment, right? The problems that we've seen have been when a school is informally offering an accommodation to a student, right? They might let them stay a little bit late to finish up tests, right? Or they might allow them to get pulled out of class and take some of their tests in a separate room to manage anxiety, right? But if those accommodations are not specified in the 504 or the IEP that the school has on file, when that gets sent to College Board or gets sent to ACT, they don't see evidence of that, they will deny those requests, even though it's in practice happening at the school, it's not documented. And so that's where we've seen most of the issues in getting accommodations. There are some other differences. Yeah, I think we could get in the weeds on this, but feel free to email us later if you do have more specific questions about SAT versus ACT, multi-day, in school. There's a lot of different accommodations, and we really have seen a lot of these things. So feel free to ask us afterwards. Hannah, do we have other Q&A outstanding questions?
Yep. I didn't know quite what the live button did, but now I found out. So one question raised, going hand in hand with the accommodations question is how and where will students with the multiple day ACT testing accommodation, which is typically done over the course of 2 weeks during their school day, be able to test. And SAT is a similar accommodation for school-based testing as well. The answer is still, TBD, depending on if schools reopen. If the student's school, their personal school, so let's say a Staples student, and Staples does not reopen, there are external testing sites that have taken students students outside of their population, or high school students, because some of the testing sites are universities. So we have contacts at several different locations, and we're working on expanding that list. So it's a matter of contacting those coordinators and arranging for the children to be able to take their test over the 2 special testing windows this summer.
I also just clicked the live button. I'm going to join you in solidarity, Hannah. So, the question asked was, I read that the lack of international applicants will make it easier for domestic students who are not applying for financial aid to get into certain schools. Is this for class of 2021 both, or not true? This is primarily for the class of 2021, and there is some truth to it. The reason for that is that simply you're removing a portion of a population that would otherwise be in the applicant pool. So you are likely to see, and this is probably more true for early decision than it is for regular decision, you are likely to see admit rates climb as a general rule. It'll vary from school to school, but you're likely to see a trend of admit rates climbing in early decision in cases where you have qualified, and that is the key word, where you have qualified applicants who are in a position to pay the tuition. So yes. And I'll elaborate on that a little bit. For class of 2020, what we're starting to see happen is we're starting to see schools move to their wait lists a lot sooner and in greater numbers than we normally do. A lot of that is due to the fact that they are making assumptions that they are going to have to scramble to fill seats, either because the cost of that college education just became out of reach for somebody because of the economic downturn, or something along those lines, or you've got all of a sudden a kid who is going to stay home with family because they're caring for a family member who is ill. Colleges are going to do what they have to do to fill their seats, and to the extent they can, preserve their selectivity. So it's true for the class of 2021 under those conditions. And then as far as the wait lists go, in that regard, it's true for the class of 2020.
Any questions we haven't answered yet? Obviously, we're not going anywhere. You can reach us by email. And we did want to try and communicate a lot to a lot of people all at once, because so much has happened in the past few weeks. I will just kind of leave you with a few closing thoughts. Again, this is really extraordinary, and we just haven't seen anything like this in our lifetimes, right? Certainly not in test prep, but also just more broadly in any way, shape, or form. And so I do really think it's incredible to see how schools are working hard, how students are working hard to adapt, and parents are doing their best, right? We're all trying, right, to find our way through the new normal. And I guess I would really encourage us to have our students try to keep a sense of normalcy, right? To try to think like, this is still school. This still counts. It's junior year, it's senior year, right? It's sophomore. Like this counts. This is not like a snow day, right? As we thought it might be in the first few days, the early days of this, right? This is real, and we have to adapt. We have to make all the efforts we can to kind of keep moving forward. We want to mitigate anxiety for students, and I'm grateful that colleges are trying to respond to those concerns for people who are impacted. But we also can't get just a free pass, right? This is not like go directly to go and collect $200. There's going to be work involved in this for our students, and we're going to have to encourage them to do that, right? So we'll stay abreast of things. I'm following all this on Twitter on a daily basis. Alex is monitoring all the discussions at IECA and among the advisors and the admissions officers. Obviously, we've got our ears to the ground. We will notify you as soon as the fall dates are available to register for both the SAT and the ACT. we'll blast that out to you ASAP so that you can get spots and register. And again, if you have more questions, please let us know. Looks like there's one more question. I'm getting one more question. Hannah, do you see that one? Rising
Yes.
juniors.
Yeah,
yes, about
I
the
see.
summer. There we go.
Yeah.
Okay.
I see the question. So the question is, what are you recommending for rising juniors to do this summer to strengthen their college resumes, given the opportunities lost / plan for this school year? So kind of two layers to that question. I think this is a question that's probably best handled on a case-by-case basis, just because every kid's path, ambitions, and readiness for programming are different. There are tons of really, really great online programs that are happening, virtual programs that are happening as well. And many of the programs that students had signed up to participate in for the coming summer that actually had plans for a physical brick and mortar site are moving virtual as well. So I think that's one where we'd want to have a conversation with you one-on-one. If this question applies to you, we'd want to have a conversation with you one-on-one to sort of better understand what the goals are, what the plans were, and then work to help you make some decisions about what the plans could / should be.
Great. I got ahead of myself. There are still some questions not answered, so I actually want to jump in and answer a few more as well. And there's a good question about test security, which is interesting, something I'm really fascinated by and very intrigued by. So the question was about how these tests that could be administered at home, first the AP exams and then other at-home tests. So a couple of things on that in that regard. First of all, the AP exams have taken some interesting steps. They've shortened them dramatically, right? They're only 45 minutes and they're free response only. They're only written responses. There's no multiple choice. The start time has been set to exactly the same time across the entire region. So when students in Connecticut or New York City are starting to take the AP US History exam, students in Alaska and Hawaii will also be taking the test. It'll be very early in the morning for them, but they will be taking the same test online at the exact same time. So there will not be a staggered rollout that would give people a chance to kind of communicate in some way, shape, or form. Everyone starts at the same time, okay? Number one. Number two, for the AP exams, they're open note and open book, which means that they're not gonna value just delivering content in your answers, right? The only thing that's gonna count is critical thinking, well-structured arguments, well-developed discussions, and well-written pieces. And so there's a priority on the actual analysis, right? The critical thinking involved in these, and not the content behind that, because anyone could plug in a bunch of information, right? But so that's important to keep in mind. Another security element, there will be a specific browser that students will need to use for the AP exams at home. It's a lockdown browser. These are quite common for online classes. If you've ever taken an online test for an online class, typically the way those tests are administered are through a lockdown browser that locks students out of all other aspects of their computer. In many cases, there's even a virtual proctor. There's a video stream live at the same time, and the students have to take a video, like spin around, take a video of their entire room to show that they're in the room, that their phones are not sitting right next to them at the table, right? So there is a level of test security attached to that. And also, if these are being videoed, for instance, they'll notice when students' eyes will veer off and look at something, and that can be flagged and researched if necessary, if there's some concern, right? Another example of test security on the SAT or ACT, these are multiple choice tests. And for instance, on the ACT, 60 math questions. There's no reason why all 60 questions have to be delivered in the same order for all of the students, right? When you're printing thousands of these tests, millions of them really, and delivering them across the country, it's hard to kind of randomize the questions. But on a computer assessment, you can randomize the questions. And so what's my question number 7 is not this other student's question number 7. And sure, students could try to do all of them, sort them out, post them somehow, and then share them, right? But then you're going to see a lot of students who do no work through the first 40 minutes of the test, and then in the last 15, populate all of their answers. That would be flagged, right? So those are, there are a lot of test security ways. Also, the penalties are really steep. College Board made this clear. If someone cheats on the AP exams, either they find that their text matches someone else's text, right? Or some other test violation, they will be prohibited from taking SATs in the future, prohibited from taking AP exams in the future. The College Board will notify their high school and will notify the colleges that they send test scores to. So there's some pretty steep consequences. I don't think most students will risk it, and I think the technology is actually better than people suspect. And there's still photo ID. You have to show your photo when you register. They'll see your photo on the video for the test, and those scores are sent to to the college counselors at the high schools, who can also verify if they choose to. So a lot of security in those places. Again, GMAT, GRE have done it successfully. They're testing GRE, GMAT at home now, and it's working. Latest date, student can retake the exam and apply ED to a school with a test score. So typically, seniors can take the SAT or ACT in October and still apply to a November 1 deadline. In some cases, those test scores will not be done yet, right? They won't be available before November 1. So the student needs to have submitted some score before November 1 for your application to be complete. But you can then send the new score after the November 1 deadline, and the colleges will update the score, right? They will get that in early November while they're still sorting through applications, and they're really not making decisions typically until the last week in November, first week in December. They're sending these out, so you can get those scores in early November and still be on time from an October test date. Again, make sure you've sent some scores before the November 1 deadline, but you can send new ones afterwards. It's possible, and again, this is speculating, but it's possible that some colleges will extend the early decision deadline. We saw one instance where the Common App had technical difficulties, right? And the colleges responded by giving students an extra day or two. Right? Alex, I think, wants to also say the caveat that they may not want to extend deadlines, right?
They may not, but they also may. It's hard to know. And I mean, I was actually going to say that, they, with the issues with Common App, actually push deadlines back in some cases by as many as 2 to 3 weeks to allow the issue to resolve itself. I think in a lot of ways, colleges are going to look to be supportive of the applicant and mindful of their numbers. They want to get applications. They want people to apply to them. So, I think, here we are in April, and there's a lot of good planning that we can do in terms of strategic next steps. But we don't know definitively what colleges will do on, November 1st, whether they'll push that back to December 1st, but there is definitely a possibility that they could do that.
So something else that I saw, a question I want to answer, what are point gains? What are typical point gains that people can expect on the ACT? So averages are misleading. This is rule number 1 of statistics, right? Averages are misleading. So we actually don't report average score gains because people at the top of the spectrum can't improve very much. When you're starting out with a 32, right, there's only so much room to go from there. But the model that's worked the best, when we've done this data analysis, and we've looked at years of students who've worked with us, the best predictive model for where a student will end up is halfway between their baseline score and a perfect score. So if you look at where a student starts on their diagnostic test in 10th grade, let's say a student gets a 26 on their first go round, right? That's 10 points away from a 36. And so our model predicts that you would expect about a 5-point gain to a 31. Now, again, some students outperform that, right? And if they work a little bit harder, if they started low for a particular reason, and that score may not have been fully representative of their abilities, but best model, best prediction would be to say about halfway from where they're starting towards that perfect score. So how do we keep tutoring if the ACT is postponed in the fall? So we have been working virtually, and so there's a technical aspect to that I can answer. It is quite possible for us to do really good work at a distance with students. We've had a long history with remote test prep. For a little bit of context, we have some software that we use that's proprietary software designed explicitly for remote instruction. It was built by a former tutor of ours who was a Yale undergraduate. He dropped out for a year, worked on this software product to do remote tutoring software, and worked for us while he was building it. And it was this great opportunity to have some input into how to design this platform. And it's a platform that we still use called Tutor Trove. And it allows us to import documents, to bring in a PDF of a test, to highlight on top of it, to cross out answer choices, and really work just like we would if we were working one-on-one with a student, paired with visual video conferencing software, Zoom, Skype, FaceTime, whatever it is that works. One really interesting element of that software is that he built in, and remember was a Yale student at the time, was a math and physics double major, he built in a graphing calculator engine that could take equations and graph them on the screen in real time. And it was actually pretty incredible software that had turned into Desmos, which is the graphing calculator that students use online in most high schools across the country. And the calculator that will be part of embedded in online SAT and ACTs in the future. So we're really fortunate that we've had access to that software for a long time, had a lot of practice delivering instruction remotely. Another Yale student who tutored for us when he was at an undergraduate started a company called 36 Education that works remotely with students across the country, and it only works online with students. So we have a lot of experience working with students, and their point gains are very similar to ours. So it's not quite the same. I would love to be in person in many respects, but I actually enjoy the software a lot, and we've a lot of success doing that. In terms of pacing, we would love for students to get their scores now in a practice test and then take a break. We really want to see students build the skills, demonstrate that they can do as well as they need to, and then let them have the summer off and pick it back up again, a little bit before the test comes, right? This is not a midterm. This is not a midterm where it's content driven and students need to study a lot of material and content and keep it fresh. This is skills driven. If the students learn the skills, they're not going to magically forget how to do a reading passage over the summer, right? They might need a little bit of a refresher, right? But we want to see students demonstrate on a practice test in April, in May, in June, that they can get their target scores, and then we will send them away and say, enjoy your summer, go hit the beach, do whatever you can at the appropriately safe distance, okay? But let's get the scores, let's build the skills and get that, and then let's take a break, because the flip side is there's a lot of stress. Okay, now we have to get ready for a September ACT. How soon do you start? How far do you back that up if they haven't gotten their scores already on a practice test? We don't know what it's going to take, and they don't know if they're going to be able to get those scores. It's so much better to get them. Everybody can breathe that sigh of relief. I've done it on a practice test. I know I can do it. And they might need a little bit of a refresher in the fall, but they'll get back there, right? So our advice is prep now, take practice tests now, use this window of time when school is slow to take advantage of this, and then get the scores on a practice test and walk away. So that's how we want to manage it. Pass, fail. Pass, fail. So there are some schools that have given students the choice of whether to go pass, fail. Alex, what do we say about pass, fail?
If you have the choice to take grades or to go pass, fail, you take the grades. Although I wonder if the person asking this question, I don't know if they have the luxury of making that decision. If you have the opportunity to take, grades, you take the grades, because it keeps you accountable to the work, keeps you focused. And actually, in a lot of ways, the work that students are doing right now remotely is in many ways easier than what they would be doing if they were in person. So this is a real opportunity to bring grades up, especially, if you're a junior and you're looking to sort of bring that GPA up and to try and sort of establish that upward trend. If you don't have the luxury of being able to choose between pass, fail, and taking grades, my advice is that you do everything you can to, and the specific question is, if your child's school is pass-fail this term, what would be your advice to them about how to use this time to improve their candidacy for their target schools? My first piece of advice would be ensure that the learning doesn't stop. And the reason I say that is so much of learning is sequential. What they do or conversely don't do this spring is going to impact what they're ready to do or conversely not ready to do come next fall. And so, again, staying accountable to the work, seeking subject tutoring, seeking additional sessions, seeking ways to get direct one-on-one interaction, whether that's through the schools, whether that's through your child's tutor. Those are all really great things. But my first point there would be just make sure that the learning doesn't stop. My second piece of advice then would be, what you want to do is find ways to fill the time meaningfully. There's a lot of stuff that's going on right now where kids are availing themselves of the free time, and one kid is making a COVID tracker app through a website, and it's tracking human contact and all of this stuff, and it's really fascinating. Other kids are finding ways to get involved with presidential elections or local elections, or basically finding ways to get politically involved. But there are things that you can do to fill time. So I would say, first and foremost, don't stop the learning. That's going to be most important, because how you do this spring is going to dictate how ready you are for the fall. And secondly, find ways to fill the time, to allow kids to advance projects that they've been working on, to find projects to work on, and just to really kind of keep them busy and keep them engaged.
Great. And there's one other thing I'd like to mention about the sort of the human contact. Alex mentioned relationships, FaceTime with teachers, right? Students are still going to need recommendations from their teachers, right? And if the student disappears off the radar during online school, that's going to be noticeable, right? If the student stays engaged, asks questions, right, in dialogues, that is a chance for that student to stand out. So I would encourage parents to encourage students, right, to be engaged and have the kids be present, right? This is a chance, even though we're all behind our screens, it's a chance still to kind of reach out and build relationships as much as possible. The students who demonstrate interest, who show enthusiasm, who ask questions, they get noticed, and then it shows in the recommendation letters, right? The teachers will mention things very specifically, their anecdotes in their letters, and the colleges will pick up on that and notice that some kids get some fluff in their recommendation letters, and other kids have substance where the teachers have real anecdotes to talk about the degree of involvement and investment that kids maintained even during this time. The other thing I'll mention, and this is for students and parents of rising seniors, right, class of 2021, there are virtual tours right now, and there are two kinds of virtual tours in visiting schools, right? You can either register at some colleges, you can actually go online and register, and the college sees that you demonstrated interest, or you can watch YouTube videos or other things that are not really being tracked, right? Our recommendation is to try and show the school, to let the school know that you're demonstrating interest. So if they do not have a registration form, if you don't actually request to be part of a virtual tour or a virtual webinar at the college, do the untracked one, watch the YouTube video, watch things on their website, but then in May, follow up with an email to let the rep for your region for that school know, look, I watched the video, I was really interested in these couple specific things. You have to insert a couple of details, right, that show you watched it, right? Only people who watched that video would know these things, right? As a way of generating that connection, demonstrating interest, that you're being proactive as a student, even in the midst of all this. The second thing is, from a planning perspective, how do you do early decision when you can't go someplace, right? So our advice is to do all the work that students can do and families can do, all the legwork virtually, and then hope that they can make trips when things open up in September, later in the summer, whenever that is, right? And be poised to make a quick trip to decide between a couple of schools, finalize an ED, and then make that commitment, because we do believe there'll be an advantage this year. The schools will want to, they're going to be risk adverse, right? There's all of these changes going on. and they don't know how many kids are going to say yes. They'll want to have students committed to the ED population. If you're able to make that commitment, visit maybe in the fall and turn around quickly for an ED application, that could be a real advantage. Well, you guys have been amazing. There's over half the people stuck with us through an hour and a half. I give you guys a ton of credit, and this was great. So again, I do wish in many ways that we could have done this more in a face-to-face environment, but this is our current reality, and we're trying to make the best of it for everybody. We want our students are on Zoom all day. It's only fair that we can do the same and make the best of it. So thanks again to Alex and Hannah for your input, your advice, for facilitating questions behind the scenes and queuing things up for this. I really appreciate it. And again, thanks to everyone for good questions and for your attendance. Feel free to email us with further questions, and let's keep talking about these things. It's a brave new world out there, and we're just going to keep moving forward until we see land and we can open the doors and get back out of the ark. So, all right, be well, stay safe, stay social distancing, have your masks, all right, and we'll see you on the other side. Take care.
Thank you.